Sandra Bullock stepped onto the red carpet of the exclusive Parisian fashion show, her beige dress a striking contrast to the extravagance around her. While other guests shimmered in sequins and bold couture, Sandra embodied a quiet confidence, the kind of elegance that doesn't demand attention, yet commands respect. As she took her seat in the front row, the murmur of hushed conversations filled the air. Not all of them were kind. Just a few seats away, two elegantly dressed influencers exchanged amused glances, whispering behind their manicured hands. "That's Sandra Bullock, right?" one of them scoffed, her voice dripping with condescension. "Yes, but honestly, beige at a show like this?" the other replied, suppressing a smirk. "She was a star, years ago, but now she just looks outdated trying to stay relevant." They laughed softly, unaware that their careless words had been overheard. And what they didn't know, someone else had heard them too, someone sitting just behind them, someone whose presence alone could silence an entire room. And in just a few moments, Keanu Reeves would change everything. What happens next will shock you, and Sandra Bullock's response will be something they will never forget. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The night was electric in Paris. The crisp September air carried the scent of fresh flowers, arranged throughout the entrance of the Palais de Tokyo, the venue for one of the most anticipated fashion shows of the season. The red carpet gleamed under the relentless flashes of cameras, capturing every esteemed guest who made their way inside. Among them, one figure stood out, not for extravagance, but for her effortless grace. Sandra Bullock, one of Hollywood's most respected stars, glided down the carpet with a natural poise that seemed to defy time. Her beige dress, elegantly cut and impeccably tailored, contrasted sharply with the bold, flamboyant outfits that dominated the evening. The actress's choice was deliberate. She had always believed that true elegance lay in simplicity and timelessness, not in the need to demand attention. Photographers recognized her instantly, and the flashes intensified. "Sandra, over here, please." Voices called from all directions. She responded with a genuine smile, offering a subtle wave, graceful, never over the top. Her makeup was light, her hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. While some might consider her look too understated for an event of this magnitude, others saw in her a refreshing authenticity, a stark contrast to the excess surrounding her. She made her way to the grand entrance, where the event staff greeted her warmly. Her seat was reserved in the front row, a position of prestige occupied only by the most distinguished guests. Sandra nodded in appreciation and walked toward her chair, well aware of the gazes following her. It wasn't just curiosity, there was also silent judgment. As she settled into her seat, a murmur rose beside her. Two social media influencers, both brunette and dressed in eye-catching shimmering gowns, entered the same row. Their perfectly styled hair and heavy makeup reflected the bright event lights. They whispered to each other, stifling laughter as they observed those around them. "Wait, is that Sandra Bullock?" one of them muttered, not bothering to lower her voice. "Yeah, I expected something more spectacular. That dress, beige? Seriously?" the other replied with a hushed giggle. Sandra heard them. She pretended not to notice, keeping her gaze fixed on the still empty runway. This wasn't the first time she had faced remarks like these. The world of fame could be cruel, and the fashion industry even more so. Still, something about those words stung a little more than it should have. "She was amazing in the 90s, but her time has passed, don't you think?" the first influencer added, her voice laced with faux innocence. "Exactly. Like, who even dresses like that for an event like this?" Sandra took a slow, deep breath. Her heart didn't race, her cheeks didn't flush with embarrassment. She had been through far worse. Even so, the words lingered in the air, an invisible poison. And then a voice emerged from behind them. The tone was calm, yet there was something unmistakably firm about it. A presence that, even before being seen, demanded respect. Sandra sensed it first, even before turning to look. The influencers, on the other hand, remained oblivious, completely unaware that they had just been overheard by the wrong person. A tense silence settled over the front row. The lights in the hall gradually dimmed, and the murmur of the guests faded into an expectant silence. The show was about to begin. The large screen at the end of the runway lit up, displaying the first glimpses of the collection. Then, the first notes of the orchestral soundtrack resonated through the venue, setting the perfect atmosphere. Sandra, seated in the front row, maintained her composed expression. She had always appreciated the world of fashion, not just as an aesthetic display, but as an art form, a reflection of culture and individuality. To her, every fabric, every cut, and every texture were fragments of a story designers sought to tell. The first model emerged at the end of the runway, wearing a structured and sophisticated piece. The cameras flashed in near-perfect unison, capturing the moment. The applause started softly, but quickly grew, following the rhythm of the show. One model after another walked with precise synchronization, their expressions unreadable, while the audience observed in quiet admiration. Sandra clapped politely at each new piece unveiled. Her eyes studied the details, the way the fabric draped, the daring nature of some combinations, the fluidity of movement. But while she absorbed the beauty of the spectacle, the influencers beside her had a different focus. "Oh, that's way too much," one of them muttered, rolling her eyes as a voluminous, translucent gown appeared. "I'd never wear that. Looks like my grandma's curtains," the other scoffed, barely containing her laughter. Sandra, once again, pretended not to hear. She knew fashion was subjective, but the two women seemed less interested in the show and more invested in making snide remarks. For a fleeting moment, Sandra wondered if that mindset would ever change. In the past, during the peak of her career, criticism came from tabloids. Now it came from social media. Anyone with a phone could broadcast unfiltered, cruel opinions to millions. "But nothing tops this look sitting next to us, right?" one of the influencers whispered, glancing directly at Sandra. The other chuckled, eyes scanning Sandra's understated beige dress. "I know, right? It screams I tried to be elegant, but picked the wrong decade." Sandra held her composure, but this time it was personal. She took a slow breath and fixed her gaze on the runway, trying to refocus on the intricate details of the designs. But it was too late. Their words had already seeped in, like poison. No matter how strong she was, no matter how much experience she had, she wasn't immune to the sting of public ridicule, especially knowing that within hours, comments like these could be circulating online for millions to see. The isolation intensified. Despite the bustling crowd, the dazzling spotlights, and the rhythmic procession of models, she felt alone. And then, a final remark crossed the line. "It's kind of sad, right? She used to be an icon. Now she's just another woman clinging to relevance." This time, Sandra felt the blow, because deep down, that was the fear haunting an entire generation, the fight against invisibility, the idea that, after a certain age, women become unseen. Her eyes blinked slowly. She didn't want to show that their words affected her, but something in her posture changed. For a brief moment, she considered speaking up, not to defend herself, but to challenge the shallow, disposable mindset that the influencers seemed to embody. But before she could make a decision, an unexpected sound broke the silence behind them. Someone cleared their throat. It was subtle, discreet, but heavy with intent. The influencers froze. Sandra noticed it too. Someone had been sitting behind them, listening to everything, and now that person was about to speak. The lights of the runway continued to shine, casting an ethereal glow over the models as they walked with precision. But in the front row, the real spectacle was unfolding in silence. Sandra felt it, the exact moment when the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle but undeniable. The air grew heavier. The silence wasn't casual anymore. It was tense. The influencers beside her froze in place. They hadn't turned around yet, hadn't seen who had cleared their throat behind them. But the weight of that presence was enough to change everything. Sandra already knew. She didn't need to turn to recognize the kind of magnetism that only a handful of people in the world possessed. Slowly, she glanced over her shoulder. Keanu Reeves, seated directly behind the influencers, dressed in a sharp black suit, a crisp shirt with no tie, his hair slightly tousled. He wasn't someone who sought attention, but his presence alone commanded it. His expression was unreadable, His body language relaxed, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet calculation, a steadiness that carried weight. Keanu wasn't the kind of man who needed to raise his voice to make a point. He didn't need to. All it took was a single word. Funny. The word hung in the air. One of the influencers forced a laugh. "Oh, hi," she said, turning around with a hesitant smile, as if hoping Keanu hadn't heard what they had been saying. But he had. He always did. Keanu tilted his head slightly, watching them for a beat longer than was comfortable. And then, with the kind of calm that was more unnerving than anger, he asked, "What exactly did you find so funny?" The hit landed. This time, there was no immediate response. The other influencer shifted in her seat, searching for something to say. The fashion show continued, but now, people weren't watching the runway anymore. The guests around them had noticed the shift. Some discreetly glanced over their shoulders. They knew something was happening. One of the influencers, still clinging to her smile, attempted to smooth things over. "Oh, nothing really, just making comments about fashion, you know. These events always bring a lot of opinions." Keanu's lips quirked slightly, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "I see, but I don't think you were talking about fashion." His voice remained level, but the weight of his words was impossible to ignore. "You were talking about a person." The moment he said it, the air seemed to tighten. The influencer who had spoken first opened her mouth to protest, but Keanu lifted just one finger, an almost imperceptible motion that said, "Don't bother." "And you were wrong." His tone was calm, steady, but unshakable. Sandra sat still, watching. Something inside her shifted. She had spent years brushing off these kinds of remarks, years pretending they didn't affect her. But watching Keanu here, stepping in so effortlessly, the emotion hit her all at once. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the need to defend herself, because someone else was doing it for her. And not just anyone, Keanu. The influencers, on the other hand, were spiraling. The younger one fidgeted with her hands, nervously picking at her rings. Now, she was the one feeling exposed. The other one forced a laugh, though it wavered halfway through. "Oh, we didn't mean anything bad by it, it was just a joke." Keanu tilted his head slightly, considering her words. "A joke?" His expression remained neutral, but his gaze was razor-sharp. Interesting, because it didn't sound funny. This time, no one dared to answer. A few murmurs spread among the nearby guests. People had noticed. Sandra felt the quiet stares of stylists, fashion editors, and celebrities sitting in the front row. They all understood what was happening, and now the night had changed completely, and Keanu knew it. He wasn't the type to seek out drama, but he also wasn't the type to stay silent when something was wrong. Sandra knew that he hadn't done this just for her. He had done it because it was the right thing to do, and that meant more than she could express. She turned her gaze back to the runway for a moment, as if needing a second to steady herself. But then, she felt something. When she looked back at Keanu, he wasn't looking at the influencers anymore, he was looking at her. And then, something rare happened. Keanu Reeves smiled, not a small, polite smirk, not a casual grin, a real smile, warm, genuine, full of something Sandra hadn't seen in a long time, understanding. "Are you okay?" his expression seemed to ask. Sandra blinked slowly, and then she smiled back. "Yes, now I am." And just like that, as if nothing had happened, Keanu leaned back in his chair, relaxed once more. But the damage was already done. The influencers sat stiffly in their seats, staring ahead, their confidence shattered. Now, they were the ones out of place. And Sandra didn't feel invisible, not anymore. The weight of silence still lingered in the front row. It wasn't just discomfort, it was something more. A shift in the night's dynamics. The fashion show continued, models gracing the runway in stunning couture. But for many in the audience, the real show had already happened. The influencers sat frozen, their once confident expressions now stiff. The easy arrogance they had carried moments ago had evaporated. For the first time, they weren't the ones holding control, and they knew it. Sandra, meanwhile, felt different. For years, she had trained herself to ignore moments like these. She had learned to swallow her pride, to accept that the industry treated women as disposable after a certain age. But now, Now, something inside her told her that maybe she didn't have to accept it anymore. Keanu hadn't needed to raise his voice. All he had done was state the truth. And now, these women were feeling the weight of their own words. One of the influencers, the younger one, tried to recover first. She pulled out her phone, opening Instagram, pretending to be busy. The other shifted uncomfortably, leaning toward her friend to whisper something. But the subtle tilt of heads from nearby guests made it obvious people were still paying attention. Then, from a few seats down, a well-known magazine editor, a distinguished man with silver hair and an impeccably tailored suit, let out a small, deliberate HM before offering Sandra a brief, knowing smile. A quiet show of support. It was subtle, but others began to respond. A few women in the audience exchanged glances and nodded slightly. Sandra felt it. What Keanu had done wasn't just an isolated moment. It was a reminder. A reminder that many people no longer wanted to be complicit in this kind of behavior. And that realization made the influencers shrink even further. The influencers weren't stupid. They knew their reputations were on the line. The older one, the clear leader of the two, decided to take control. She forced a laugh, exhaling as if brushing off the tension, and then raised her voice just enough for the surrounding guests to hear. Wow, people are taking things way too seriously, huh? Silence. She let out a light, practiced laugh, tossing her hair back. It was just a silly comment, no need for this whole vibe. She cast a glance toward Keanu, hoping for some kind of validation, but he remained silent, expression neutral. His neutrality was worse than any response. The other influencer, realizing they needed to recover quickly, turned to Sandra with a rehearsed smile. "Oh, Sandra, we love you. Seriously, you're an icon. It was just a joke. I hope you didn't take it the wrong way." Sandra blinked slowly. She saw it for what it really was, an attempt to erase the moment, to rewrite the narrative as if none of it had happened. But the audience wasn't stupid. Keanu stayed quiet. He didn't need to say anything anymore. He had already said enough. Now the decision was Sandra's, and for the first time in a long time, she chose not to stay silent. She turned slowly to the two women. She smiled faintly, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Then in a voice as calm as it was sharp, she said, "Funny, because it didn't sound like a joke." The exact words Keanu had used earlier. The impact was immediate. The influencers sat frozen. Sandra turned her gaze back to Keanu. He was already looking at her. He didn't smile this time, but his eyes said everything, a silent acknowledgement, as if to say, "I knew you had this in you." And for the first time in ages, Sandra felt something she hadn't in a long time, seen. The show came to an end. Guests stood, murmuring about the collections, about the designs. But some were still murmuring about what had happened in the front row. The influencers, they disappeared quickly. Sandra rose from her seat with ease, picking up her clutch without a rush. She had all the time in the world, but then, a familiar voice called out, "Sandra, a moment?" She turned, a well-known journalist, sharp, respected, always chasing a meaningful story. Sandra smiled. "Of course." The journalist held a small recorder, excitement flashing in her eyes. "I really want to talk to you about this, about how women in the industry are treated, about what happened here tonight." Sandra hesitated for a brief second, but then something inside her said, "It's time to speak." She nodded. "I think it's an important conversation." The journalist's smile widened. "Great, because I think the world needs to hear it." And as Sandra left the venue, walking toward the interview, her phone vibrated. A message. She unlocked the screen and read it. "Good answer. See you at the premiere. K." Sandra smirked to herself. Then she walked forward and didn't look back. Sandra didn't turn immediately, but she felt it. The whispers came first. "She's here." It's been years since she's appeared at an event like this. Then she caught a familiar scent, a signature fragrance, hints of jasmine, musk, and the faintest touch of vanilla. Slowly she turned, and there she was, a woman who seemed to have stepped out of another time. Her silver hair shimmered under the event lights, her posture effortless yet commanding. The presence of Coco Chanel was unmistakable. Yes, Coco Chanel, the woman who redefined fashion itself. Even after all these years, her name still shaped the industry. And now, she was walking straight toward Sandra. The room fell silent. The influencers, still reeling from their earlier embarrassment, watched in disbelief, because they knew they were about to witness something far greater than themselves. Sandra rose from her seat, unsure of what to expect. But Coco knew exactly what she was doing. She walked up, her gaze locked on Sandra. And then, without hesitation, she took Sandra's hands in hers. A hush fell over the room, and then Coco smiled. "My dear, you remind me what true elegance is." Sandra felt the weight of those words hit her like a wave, because they weren't just words, they were validation. The woman who had defined elegance in the 20th century was recognizing Sandra as someone who embodied it. Nothing could be greater than that. The murmurs returned, but this time they weren't whispers of gossip or judgment. They were whispers of admiration. A renowned fashion editor leaned toward a colleague. "She was just endorsed by Chanel. This is history happening in front of us." The influencers turned pale, because they understood what this meant. At that moment, they lost whatever argument they had, because in the world of fashion, there was no higher authority than Coco Chanel. And Coco had chosen Sandra. Sandra, still processing, smiled humbly. "That means a lot to me." Coco kept her hands over Sandra's, and then she said something that would define the entire night. "Elegance isn't about being seen, it's about being remembered." Sandra felt chills, because suddenly it all made sense. True value wasn't about demanding attention. It wasn't about standing out louder than others. It was about being timeless, just like Coco, and now just like Sandra. The influencers sat stiffly in their seats. There was no point in apologizing and trying to justify themselves now, because the story had already been written. Sandra didn't just come out on top, she became something greater. And them? They became irrelevant. Sandra felt a gaze on her and instinctively lifted her eyes. Keanu was still there, and he wasn't surprised. It was as if he had known all along that this moment was meant to happen. And maybe he had, because Keanu always saw beyond the surface. And now, his expression was clear. "I knew you had this in you." Sandra felt warmth rise in her chest. For the first time in a long time, she believed it too. She smiled at him. And Keanu? He smiled back. Coco took a step back, but her presence lingered. She scanned the audience, her gaze sweeping over the faces, watching in awe. And then, with a knowing glint in her eyes, she said, "I have always believed that fashion is temporary, but style is eternal." Then she looked directly at Sandra and said the final words of the night, "And you, my dear, are eternal." The room erupted into applause. This time there was no doubt. Sandra didn't need to fight for relevance anymore. She had become a part of history. And as the world began to talk about this iconic moment, Sandra's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, unlocking it to see a new message. "You never had to prove anything to anyone, but it was beautiful to watch. K." A soft laugh escaped her lips as she shook her head. And then, without looking back, she walked forward. The venue was still buzzing with conversation, but the focus was no longer on the fashion show. Sandra's name was on everyone's lips. She hadn't just been defended by Keanu Reeves. She had been endorsed by Coco Chanel. What started as an ordinary evening had turned into a historic moment. The influencers had disappeared into the crowd, their voices now insignificant. Sandra, on the other hand, was at the center of everything. As she navigated through the admiring glances and whispered praises, a journalist approached, holding a recorder with an alert, eager look in her eyes. "Sandra, a moment?" Sandra recognized her immediately. It was Isabelle Laurent, a renowned journalist known for her sharp interviews and her ability to never miss a good story. "Of course," Sandra replied, adjusting herself with poise. They stepped aside to a quieter corner of the venue as Isabelle pressed the record button. "What happened here tonight was unexpected, wasn't it?" Isabelle started with a small smile. Sandra gave a knowing smile, taking a brief moment before answering. "I'd say it was inevitable." The journalist raised an eyebrow. "Inevitable? What do you mean by that?" Sandra took a deep breath before speaking. "I've been through moments like this before. The entertainment and fashion industries have always demanded that women constantly reinvent themselves, as if we have an expiration date. I got used to being judged. But today, Today was different. Isabel leaned in slightly, intrigued. Because Keanu Reeves stepped in? Sandra smiled. No, because I decided not to let it slide. The answer made Isabel jot something down quickly. Do you think this moment could change something in the industry? Sandra took a thoughtful pause before responding. Change is already happening. What happened tonight wasn't just about me. It was about every woman who has ever been dismissed as a joke simply for aging, for not desperately seeking attention, for staying true to herself. The camera flashes flickered as Sandra stepped out of the event. But this time, she wasn't just another face in the crowd. She had become a statement. The moment between her, Keanu, and Coco Chanel had already gone viral. People weren't just talking about fashion anymore. They were talking about authenticity, about respect, about the kind of elegance that doesn't fade with time. And for the first time in a long time, Sandra didn't feel like she was trying to hold on to relevance. She was defining it. By morning, headlines had shifted. Luxury brands were rethinking their campaigns. Industry leaders were speaking out against the toxic culture of ageism. The public had chosen a side, one that celebrated women for who they truly were. And the influencers? Their voices had gone silent. Sandra didn't need to see their reaction to know the truth. Authenticity had won. That afternoon, an email arrived. The Paris Fashion Council wanted Sandra to deliver a keynote speech on timeless elegance and authenticity. For the first time in her career, she wasn't just a guest at the table, she was the one setting it. And as she stood by her window, looking out at the city that once dictated who was relevant and who wasn't, she realized something. Elegance isn't about the dress you wear. It's about the confidence with which you wear yourself. True beauty doesn't fade with time. It deepens, it strengthens, it becomes unshakable. And Sandra, she had never felt more powerful, because real elegance isn't about being remembered for a moment. It's about being unforgettable.